Welcome to episode 3 of the Security Gets Serious podcast. Today is April 23rd, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing Jon Miller, CEO of Halcyon. Jon, thank you for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be invited to this.
Well, look, I mean, you kind of are the reason for us being here. So
I'm pretty sure I'm paying the bill. Yeah.
Well, that does go with it. Yeah. So to start off, when we think about ransomware, I think one of the things I wanted to cover first is what's the most common misconception about ransomware that people have?
I think that it can't be stopped, right? We're getting to a point now where you see these big companies going down that have, mature programs, mature technology, the best of everything, and they're still getting breached, right? But ransomware isn't an impossible hurdle to get over, right? Like, you definitely can't be cookie cutter the same as everyone. They figured out how to bypass that. But if you do get creative and you do understand the ransomware groups that target you, which is another interesting thing. It's not like ransomware groups go out and compromise diverse companies all over. They like to target what they know and keep everything close. If you
there's kind of a formula to it, right? About the different groups, they have different psychologies behind.
They're trying to get the efficiency, right? Yeah. So do what you know, and it gets faster and more profitable instead of all over the place. And they've done a good job of specializing in verticals, essentially. So profile what vertical you're in. Look at the threat actors there. I love our ransomware MQ for really going into who everyone's targeted at, and then increase your knowledge about their TTPs, and you can very I guess probably not easily, but you very much can build counters to their techniques that'll get them to bail out even if they get in.
So you said that it's something that can be stopped, but I guess the question then would rise, why isn't it being stopped? Why aren't we seeing more companies use efficient strategies?
I think that everyone tries to go after due diligence, right? Like, I want to do a reasonable job based on an understanding of what my peers are doing or what regulations kind of require me to do.
Due diligence or minimum bar?
It depends, who's defining the minimum bar, right? Yeah. Like, a lot of the larger companies out there definitely aren't trying to do minimum bar, but there's not a lot of appetite to take on risk to protect against, esoteric threats, right? And now we're getting into a point where, organizations do have to be more intentional with what they're investing in. And it's not just broad security anymore where, you have to have your patches and your firewalls, which are super important, MFA, stuff like that. You actually have to, understand your attack surface and your threat landscape.
Yeah, I think that's, thinking from an operator being in the seat, like, it's one of the, I guess, the challenging things that we always struggle when we're talking to C-level or boards is that you're never really eliminating a technology, right? It's very rare that you get the opportunity to come in and say, okay, we don't need this anymore because the threats have moved on. So it's this additive component. Well,
and you've seen a lot of fatigue, right? Where, essentially security companies over the last 15 years have been built off of a single feature, right? And, having 30 different companies all with an individual feature that add up together into something much stronger isn't convenient for anyone. Managing them, taking care of them, renewing them. So everybody wants platformification, right? Like, they want, a single pane of glass that kind of runs everything. And
do you think that'll ever work, though? Like, I've seen that happen. Look, back in the day, I worked for Network Associates at the time, right? Yeah. And they were trying to bring a bunch of different stuff together, right? Some not even, it wasn't just security, right? It was network management, it was help desk, it was, PGP, like a lot of different stuff kind of fell apart. But there's been a lot of companies that have gone down that route and it hasn't really worked out that well.
Yeah, I think it's really hard incorporating security product into security product, right? And, for the most part, you don't sell a company unless something's going wrong,
Yeah.
right? I mean, sometimes somebody will make an offer you can't refuse, but normally, you look for an exit when you're not hitting your, scaling business plan. And so you look for that easy out. And it, frankly puts the acquiring company into a spot where they're buying something that isn't completely functional. So not only do they have to figure out what's wrong and fix it, they also have to figure out how to integrate it into a different stack. And everybody wants the simplicity and the ease of use, but that's not what security is really about.
Yeah,
Unfortunately.
it never is, right? It doesn't. It doesn't come back to that.
It's all about technical complexity and the fine details.
Yeah, which a lot of people don't want to spend the time to actually work on.
No, well, and it's hard to understand, right? Like I always
and hard to explain.
Yeah, I always saw security as the level past kind of IT. Like if you get really, really good at IT where you understand how everything works, you can get to a level where you can figure out how to subvert it, right? And that alone adds some scaling challenges when it comes down to, I have this massive team, I need to scale it, I need to respond to these events. It's really hard to get that deep level of expertise that's really necessary to do security well.
Yeah. So I want to pivot a little bit back to kind of the ransomware problem. And I'm just wondering, when we think about ransomware and how it's morphed and how the business model, because it's really being kind of treated as a business, how does the ransomware as a service model really contribute to the proliferation of ransomware attacks? And do you see that there's an effective counter strategy to this?
Oh, all right. Well, let's take the first one.
Just a small question.
Yeah. The ransomware as a service has exploded it, right? Because originally we started off with these, and I'm going to speak in a generality where it's mainly true, but not always true. But it was Russian groups, right?
Sure.
Where they had these amazing skills, right? They had the ability to evade the EDRs and build this highly complex malware, right? And it was a gatekeeping factor, right? Like the threat really came from those FSB and GRU guys going out and leveraging an attack against an entity. And
as a result of the change in economy there when they were out of work and had to find...
Or not even out of work, right? Just looking for some extra pocket change, right?
Okay.
Like I've seen some interesting intel reports where they had real-time tracking of these people by their cell phones. And you literally saw them go to like the FSB cyber thing. And then at like 4:00, they left and they went to an apartment building together where they worked together for like 4 or 5 hours. And then they went home, right? So it was literally like you leave work, you go to your second job, and then and then you're done, and then you just rinse and repeat. But to get back to ransomware as a service, it's exploding it. It's taken all of the technical difficulty out of it, right? There's nobody today that with 6-8 hours can figure out where the forum sites are where you can buy access from an initial access broker. You can go join a ransomware affiliate program. And then as long as you have some knowledge of systems administration, run the ransomware, on your compromised host that you didn't even have to compromise. And now you're done, right? Like it's
really democratized it.
Oh, so much more so than anything we've ever seen in the industry before. Like we don't even have anything this democratized when it comes to defense, right? Like it's now like all of this high level kind of black art around, nation state level APT. How do you hack someone undetectably, right? Is now just blasting across this ecosystem. And every day you just have these new groups that are coming up because it's easy.
Yeah, I think that makes the defense really hard because you're really dealing with essentially nation state level, right?
Yeah, but not
threat actors, but they're not the general people who are actually deploying that. it's been democratized, and so it's really hard to deal with the threat.
Yeah, it's like going around and being like, oh, you can fly a Cessna? Here's an F-35 all loaded down, right? Like, go have fun. It's dangerous because the consequence that is normally paid to have that knowledge never happens.
So, talk about the an effective mitigation strategy on that. Has that changed at all? Like how you have to think about it if you're actually trying to defend against that? What's your advice on that?
Yeah, I mean, mitigation strategies, right? I think since the birth kind of ransomware, everyone's been like the mitigation strategies, backups, right? Like if you have backups when something happens, you restore, you don't have to pay. And we've seen that value prop go way down, right? Where after they get domain admin, the first thing they do is go after the backups. Or in cases where people have backups, logistically, it's not possible to move them over in time or move them over at a speed that is acceptable to the business, I guess would be the best way to put it.
And sometimes you got to bring up the additional infrastructure just to be able to support that, right? Which you don't have access to.
I mean, you've got to build new infrastructure, and at the same time, you've got to figure out how they got in and drive them out while you're bringing it up. And as you're negotiating with them after you've been owned, they don't stop, right? Like as you're negotiating with these guys, they're going deeper and deeper into your network and continuing to try to expand, right, until they get paid.
And then we've seen before the reintroduction of ransomware again. Like once either they paid or
I mean, it's if you pay ransomware, like you're probably going to get ransomware.
You've been marked.
Yeah, it's like the phishing text messages, right? Like you respond to that random hello and then watch, not just more traffic come in there, but come in from other
channels,
vectors. Yeah, it shows that you're a sucker, right?
So, when you think about ransomware as a service, do you see it? We had Ryan on the last episode, Ryan Perma, right?
Yeah.
We talked a lot about AI. I'm
Smart
wondering,
guy.
Very smart, good conversation about AI and ML. How do you see that changing the game and the implementation of AI and ML, both on you're laughing, like all super easy
it's not
questions,
good
right?
news, right? Like that's why it's not like, oh, well, AI is going to end this.
No, I meant actually both sides. So there's actually mitigation and then there's exacerbating the problem and making it more difficult because...
That's the key thing is that the way AI is essentially accelerating everyone else, right? It's accelerating them, right? A great example is phishing attacks, right? Like you used to be able to understand something was a phishing attack by misspellings and bad grammar. You could look at it and be like, oh, obviously this wasn't written by somebody that speaks English. This is not real, right? And now, I mean, that's gone. You've got LLMs writing, absolutely perfect content. To the point where, even the ransomware groups, when they're communicating now, will use LLMs or Grammarly or whatever to clean up their language to make it harder for people to attribute who they are, right? I've seen it where a ransomware group, just through their communications, had people believe that they were American because it's like, look at their grammar. They're obviously a native English speaker, right? And it's as simple as using a commercially available tool.
Do you think we'll see, or have you already seen the emergence of AI in the negotiation side of it, where it's actually looking at the psychology of how they actually negotiate to be able to make assessments on how they negotiate stronger?
So I've seen some examples. I haven't personally engaged, but chatbots, right? Once you're ransomed, you start chatting with the ransomware group, right? And there are groups out there that are using LLM chatbots to do that initial communication. So now you have 24/7.
And when we talk about business, as a business, people need to really understand it. It's truly as a business, right? I mean, they've got call center support. They've got, people when you call in, they're actually, picking up the phone.
They're friendly.
It's
they're
how can I help you?
They're customer service people, try to be friendly customer service, and you just don't look at the act that like, oh yeah, we're extorting you with a gun to head and people are dying in your hospital right now. And they normally will negotiate, right?
Yeah.
They'll lower the ransom. They'll prove to you that they can decrypt the data. Even after you pay, they'll help you decrypt the data if you get into a problem. It's just, it's a threat actor like we haven't really seen before.
So when you look at how they actually complete the transactions and the business model, are there any insights into the psychology that they're actually applying or using? And I mean, it's not just a matter of them coming in without any experience in this, right? There's actually a psychological background to how they approach their targets and try to manipulate, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the negotiators on their side are doing it all day, every day, right? So there's a natural improvement process that comes by doing something over and over again. And yeah, I mean, you'll see, there are multiple companies out there that specialize in ransomware negotiation or breach coaching or stuff like that, where they have these relationships, right? And it is a psychological game, for lack of a better term, right? Like making sure that you feed the right information to them to get them to respond back to you. I mean, one of the craziest stories that I had was one of the first ransomware IRs where we got brought in and someone had been breached. They were using a large kind of defense contractor as their primary IR and doing the ransomware negotiation. And the negotiator pissed off the ransomware guy and he doubled the ransom, right? On the spot. He was like, I didn't like that. Your ransom is now double. Right? Where if you're not playing it the right way, they have all the leverage.
So it sounds like you're. I have my own opinion, but I'm interested in yours. It sounds like if someone's in an incident, they've got a ransomware incident, you'd recommend using a professional negotiator, someone who's actually talented, has done this before.
Oh right? Yeah, if you're going to negotiate, you should definitely have someone that's a professional at it. If you can get by without negotiating, without talking to them, that is the ideal scenario. Right? Like it happens, if you can deal with it and respond to it and never have to reach out to them, right? It takes a bunch of the leverage out of their hands.
What's the value of the threat intelligence and actually looking at the research and identifying prior to an event happening, right? Is there a lot of value in actually effectively managing a program with threat intelligence to address a ransomware program?
I mean, I think more so now with ransomware than ever before, right? Where, if you were a defense contractor, you had a pretty good idea that the Russians and the Chinese were going to try to hack you. But because it is so segmented and there is specialty, that's really where you can get essentially a leg up, is understanding the threat groups that are probable to target you, what they're doing, what their tactics are, and then dovetailing that into your actual program, right? Like the government has something they call the OODA loop.
OODA loop, yeah.
Right? You've got to get in that OODA loop. And it's not 100 threat groups out there that are, targeting every company. If you're a retailer or a manufacturer or a healthcare company, there's a small number of groups that are specifically attacking both your industry and then companies of your like size, right?
And you referenced the work that Halcyon's done on this earlier, right? You talked about like the research that Halcyon's put together and like listed the groups.
Yeah.
They have the background on it, right?
Yeah, I believe it's called the maliciousness quartile because we can't call it a magic quadrant anymore.
I'm trying to avoid the magic quadrant.
Yeah. Magic quadrant, not allowed. It is not a magic quadrant. It's maliciousness quartile.
So when we think about maliciousness, thinking about your background, I'm interested, and for those people who don't know, we actually go back. Like we've
Yeah,
worked
long
together for a
time.
long time, right? Way back to like Accuvant days and when I was at Visa. So, and you've done some work on kind of the offensive side, right? Or
A thing or two.
thing or
Yeah,
two, yeah.
I've dabbled in it. I've made some malware.
So I'm wondering, like, when I think about the offensive side, has your background in the offensive side of security conditioned how you think about this space, and has it changed your approach to innovation and problem solving for cyber?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's super obvious in Halcyon, right? Where Halcyon, it's, for lack of a better term, is the first endpoint technology that was built to fail,
Yeah.
right? Where you know that you cannot build a defense that is impenetrable, where everybody else in this space, for the most part, rely on the fact that, we're 100%, like you buy us and you don't have to worry about it. And they're less focused on what value do you pay to the customer where they're that fraction of a percent, right? Where something gets through.
So dive a little deeper into that, because I'm interested in, when we think about that, I don't think a lot of people understand like the kind of the phased approach that you're talking about. So what's your approach to that?
Yeah. So Halcyon's an interesting tool, right? Where we come in behind the EDR, right? Which, we highly recommend. CrowdStrike, Microsoft, SentinelOne, Palo Alto, all amazing choices. And we try to fill the technical gap when it comes to essentially the zero-day variants of ransomware, right? Where the ransomware groups are either perturbing the ransomware to specifically evade an EDR, or they're just attacking the EDR directly by, attempting to disable it or blind it. And we'll actively, watch the other endpoints, make sure they're still on. If something attacks them, that's a signal of bad for us, right? We'll look for the behavior of ransomware, not just the encryption and stop it, but the data exfiltration, stop that as well. But ultimately, the biggest value that we play to customers is recovery, right? If ransomware runs, we capture the symmetric keys that are used to encrypt the files, come back in after the fact from our agent, use those keys, and just restore the system to a normal state, right? So instead of a successful ransomware attack taking weeks and weeks to recover, your recovery can be minutes in a best case, right, or hours at a worst
So a
case.
real resilience aspect
Yeah.
to it.
Yeah. I mean, protection's huge, right? Like nobody wants to be recovering as their primary response, right? But if you have the tools to recover in a way that's efficient, it makes it takes a catastrophic incident and makes it something that's business acceptable, as crazy as it sounds, right? Like if you can, I love to pick on CrowdStrike, right? Because CrowdStrike has their tagline of like, we stop breaches.
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to do is stop downtime, right? Like if I can stop the ransomware from running, ideal case. If I can't, and they do something new that nobody's seen before, which these guys are doing, they have zero-day vulnerabilities, they're very industrious. How can I reduce the downtime to a point where it just doesn't matter as much? If I'm a retailer and all of my POS systems go down in a ransomware attack, it's a huge problem, right? If I'm a retailer and one of them goes down, it's isolated to a single machine, and 10 minutes later, that machine just bloops back to normal and people are making transactions on it again. Light years different.
Minimize
to a
the
business.
downtime, right?
Yeah.
Reduce the cost.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's an adage as old as time. There are always going to be vulnerabilities to be found and exploited that we don't know about yet. And how do you protect against an unknown? And essentially it's recovery, right? Like how do you minimize the impact?
Makes a ton of sense. So I want to pivot a little bit. Let's switch away from kind of ransomware and talk a little bit more about
Line dancing?
No, we could talk about line dancing. What's your favorite line dance?
I don't have one.
See,
Right.
So
See, it's a bad
took us down a
topic.
rat hole.
The electric slide.
All right,
right.
there you go. There you go.
That's how long it's been since I line danced.
Appreciate that. I'm actually wondering about when you think about Halcyon and you creating a startup, right? What were some of the challenges? What were the hurdles that you had to overcome when you were thinking about this, going down that path and kind of actually getting into it?
Yeah. Well, Halcyon's different than any other security startup that's come before. And what really makes us different is a mentality of attacker-led growth, where if you look at a normal security company, they're looking at stopping the pantheon of security issues, right? I've got to stop, rats and Trojans and APT tools. And, the thought process behind Halcyon was this risk is so great, it really needs a focused solution, right? And in so many ways, it was met with some disbelief, right? Where you talk about ransomware is like the third rail issue in the industry. It's millions of dollars of liability, and there's zero room for error, right? I mean, if you look at a traditional antivirus,
Well, $1.6 billion room for error from Change Healthcare, right? Yeah.
well, we'll see. It keeps going up, right? They're not done yet. That number is going to get bigger. We all know the value of $1 now.
Wait for the final number, folks.
Yeah. It's definitely not going down. But I totally forgot what I was saying there. Ransomware's bad.
Yeah.
Is the crux, and it's getting worse.
So,
Now I remember. Yeah. So taking on the third rail issue, most people didn't believe that it was possible, right? Like, how could you as a startup?
That's what I was going to ask. When you're
in-
going out and you're doing the pitch and you're talking
Yeah.
to people and you're trying to get, because obviously you have to get investment, right, on this.
Yeah,
like
a lot.
Was there belief? Like, how did you get people to overcome geez, this is a hard problem and no one solved it? Like, how did you do that?
Well, it's not just it's a hard problem and no one solved it. It's what makes you special that makes you able to solve it and not everybody else. Why can't Microsoft solve this? They have unlimited money and they run Windows, right? And a lot of it came down to speed, right? Like being able to come up with the ideas for net new features that didn't exist, made sense, right? Easy to understand and actually build it and turn it into an enterprise product that actually works, right? Like we were lucky where, at the beginning, because we were focused on ransomware, we were able to build, a compelling message where when we went out and talked to CISOs, there weren't a lot of CISOs that were like, I don't see any value in that. I'm not scared of ransomware at all. Right.
That's a little bit counter to the security market where generally it's like go out and try to solve this as wide a scope as you can so it appeals to everybody. There's always been this platform or best of breed, right? But I think sometimes it's really good to be laser focused on what your objective is.
I've never seen a company really do it before in the space. I've seen them do it with a specific problem, right? Like I'm a phishing company or I'm an MFA company, but not a threat actor group where it's like we are looking at this one specific problem. And because we're looking at that one specific problem, we're not trying to play a features race game with somebody else where it's like, oh, this company has these 10 features. You need to have that 10 and 2 more. It's all about how do you build something that's individualized to deliver the most impact to the problem.
So if you went back 3 years and talked to yourself, the Jon Miller of 3 years ago, and said, man, going into this, you have this misconception about starting this cyber company. It's wrong. Like alter this perspective and you feel like you would have either done better or at least clarified. So, like, what's the misconception you had going into about starting a cyber company?
Oh, I mean about a cyber company.
Anything.
In
Just
general?
starting a company. Yeah. For the people out there who are the CISOs or the people in the industry who are thinking about starting, a startup and are like, yeah, what should I avoid?
It's definitely really hard to sell enterprise software as a startup, right? As like something that's brand new. You've got to do a lot to really build trust and viability there. The team's been amazing. right? You know, and this is hard because I can tell you my last company, we could spend hours talking about all the mistakes that I had there. If you
That's
were like,
podcast too.
if you were like, go back 6 years ago,
Yeah.
it's very colorful language. You know, I think we've had great success with Halcyon, right? You know, in the almost 2 years since we've been deploying and servicing the product, we haven't let someone down yet, right? Like we've stopped a lot of ransomware attacks that were missed kind of by the incumbents. And, you know, out of everything, I think I'm the proudest of that, right? Like the thing that scared me the most with the company was not being able to deliver enough in time to be truly effective, right? And I think that we took, you know, a unique approach around, you know, building our ML and everything and focusing on less instead of more, right? Where you just get hyper focused on something so you can get really good at it. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the investors have been great. The team's been great. Like I don't have a lot of complaints to be honest. It's been a lot of travels, a lot of stress.
Fun ride.
Right? It's both fun and terrifying at the same time, right? It's like being on
So it's the roller coaster.
it's like being on a roller coaster, but there's no like the thing that comes down that locks you in. You just have
bar.
to like hang on for yourself.
That's a good perspective. So any lessons you can share that you've learned from building and scaling, you know, because you're at B Round, right? So as you've scaled and started to build that out, any lessons that you can share?
Be honest, right? I think that, you know, it's really easy to try to, you know, when you look at scaling a company, right? There's product market fit, investors, like all of these pieces that come together. And I think you know, you have to be a fan, you have to be excited, you have to push, right? But you know, you've got to be honest both with your team, with your investors and your customers, right? Like nobody's going to expect you day one of having a 15-year mature product, right?
Yeah.
But the second that you come in and say that you have a super mature product as a startup, you're going to lose some
Expectations, right?
Yeah,
Setting
you're going to lose some
expectations.
credibility there.
Yeah.
So I think you have to be, you know, super real about what you have, what your vision is. You know, and it's weird because, you know, talking to investors nowadays, everyone wants to know how you're using AI, right? And it's so weird to get in and be
The
like,
shiny ball.
be like, oh no, this is security. We've been using AI for quite some time now. Like, are we using it? Absolutely. Is it everything we do? Absolutely not. Right? Like it's a tool. It has to get used, but you have to use it where it has strengths. Right? But yeah, I mean, don't get caught up in the hype. Right? You know, my other advice would be is you've got to find the right problem, the right TAM, and then the right solution. And there's no amount of sheer willpower that can fix one of those three problems, right? If you could have the best product in the world, but if it doesn't have the right TAM and it doesn't, you know, have that right customer fit, you're not going to have success.
So going off of that, when we think about the industry and where the industry's headed, you know, we've all been to RSA for however the last number of years, right?
Yeah,
We've been to Black Hat. We've been to everything. Like
I love the RSA conference so much. I put Art Coviello on my board of directors.
Shout out to Art, obviously. When we think about that, and like I can walk the floor every year and look at all the vendors out there, and I think, man, there's a lot of the same stuff year after year, right? It's not a lot of necessary innovation. There's not a lot of interesting things coming. Every now and then, you see something that really changes the game. And I've seen a couple interesting things of late. I talked to a startup 2 weeks ago that's like kind of seed fund, right? And I was like, wow, I think you're going to go somewhere, right? I'm interested.
Well, it's interesting because after you've been doing it for a long time, dude, you've seen everyone come and go, right?
Yeah.
It's like that corner store that can
Well,
never hold a
you can
business.
almost look at it and say, you're going to fall off the edge.
Yeah.
Like, this isn't going to work, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you know, looking out when you see that, I guess, where's the industry headed in like 2 years, 5 years? Like 5 years is always a ways out there, right? But you think of the big picture stuff. Are we getting better? Is it just more of the same and there's not real improvement? Like,
I mean,
I just feel like there's a lot of challenges there.
It obviously doesn't look like we're doing better, right? Like we have more problems today than we had yesterday.
So we're losing the battle?
Oh, I mean, I definitely feel that way. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, and I think that the breaches show it, right? Like you have companies that have never had an incident before getting crippled by ransomware, right? From the biggest of the big down to the smallest of the small. And there's no opposing force to it, right? Like the best idea everyone has is paying ransoms illegal, right? It's just, it's not going to be enough to inhibit the growth of these threat actors. So I think it's going to get wild. I think it's going to get really wild. Like, I think we're going to see more people dying. I think that we're going to see larger critical infrastructure attacks where, I don't think it's going to be the Russian guys that do a big critical infrastructure attack. I think it's going to be, a threat group in a country where there's no political issues with the U.S. government whatsoever. It's just a crime group, right?
Yeah, I almost feel like it's going to be someone who, like, I think the groups that a lot of people would probably think, Russian groups, Korean groups, like they're gonna sit behind and say, okay, those are probably going to be the people that do it because they're the most advanced. But I actually think it's going to be somebody who isn't aware of the potential impact that they cause. And as a result, it's a lot worse than anyone would expect.
There's no fear of a proportional response, right? Yeah. Like if I'm a ransomware guy in Russia, and I take down the U.S. power grid, which I think is like 9 or 12 substations, and you cascade the whole thing down. The U.S. is going to respond, right? They may not go and pull that guy out of his house, but we'll do a proportional hack back and push that pain back to him. What do you do when it's some crime group from Brazil?
Yeah.
Right? Like, you're not going to take out Brazil's power. They had nothing to do with it, right? It wasn't somebody that was sponsored or some state actor that's, doing this as their off-time job.
So, given that, what strategies do you think organizations could really use to defend effectively against ransomware in today's environment?
I mean, it's knowledge, right? Like, knowledge is power. Like I said earlier, you've got to know who's attacking you. You've got to have a good understanding of what your threat surface is. What are your devices? What are your footprint, right? What's in an overall state of the hygiene, right, of security. And then, right, once you have that done, which let's call the base minimum, you need to start investing in additional layers, right, that specifically make the most sense to combat, your crime groups. Now that we're looking at like MGM and Caesars and Change, where they're doing these super sophisticated social engineering attacks, right? Where they're going to a point doing SIM jacking and, I steal your phone number and call up. Additional controls now need to be put in place, right? You have to look at what's happening and make sure that you're not vulnerable to it. And
I think AI intersecting with social engineering and, deep fake video calls and that it's becoming a lot more complex.
I mean, you can completely build, everything from fictitious personalities all the way to duplicating it, right? Like, I can take enough pictures of your face where I can build a passable Snapchat filter where I can snap your face on mine like a mask, right? And do a video call and have someone believe it.
We'll do a session of that where we swap faces in the next podcast.
I mean, we can. It would be totally fun, right? But the whole dynamic of this is changing, and for the longest
faster
time,
than I think people are really able to accept the change.
Yeah, well, faster than we've ever seen it before. Like, we've been around since
it's kind of the Moore's law of cyber.
It's getting exponential now, right?
It really is.
Yeah.
So in the face of these increasingly sophisticated attacks, are you looking at any really innovative technologies or innovative approaches like beyond where where do you see, like, is there anything on the horizon, or are you right now just so focused on stopping what we're seeing right now that you know, how do you get ahead of it?
Yeah, I mean, MFA, right? So we track product efficacy of the products that we're deployed with, right? Like if we're stopping something, it means that something
Is it getting to
missed
another
it.
technology?
Yeah. And so we actually track back, you know, who's letting stuff through. CrowdStrike's the best, right? Like they have the lowest amount of push through, right, of any of the modern kind of EDR vendors that we're seeing. I would highly recommend CrowdStrike to anyone that, you know, doesn't have it. It's expensive, but what are you going to do? There's a reason it's expensive. Phishing, right? Credentials. Like if you're not auditing for the passwords of your users, especially your admins, against compromised passwords and stuff like that, you're doing yourself a disservice.
Yeah, admins, hardware tokens. I mean, there's a lot you can do, right? To
Absolutely.
So let's talk regulatory frameworks, everybody's favorite topic for a minute, right?
Don't worry, ISO will save us.
Just add one more control and you'll be good to go.
PCI will save us if ISO can't.
So how do regulatory frameworks impact ransomware attacks, and do you advocate for that? Do you advocate for changes in regulation or legislation around this? I mean, you know, it comes down to two questions really. First one I'll ask is, do we pay the ransomware or don't we? Right?
Yeah. So do we pay the ransomware or not?
Because you've already said that if you pay the ransomware, you're more likely to be compromised in the future,
if
right?
you can get away not paying the ransom, definitely don't pay it.
Okay.
Right? If you have to pay the ransom and keep your business going, right? Nobody's going to fault you if you're going to go out of business.
Somebody
if you
will
don't
fault you. One of your investors will sue.
I doubt it, right? Like, I couldn't think of an investor that would sue a CEO for paying a ransom where the alternative was the stock went to zero. Right?
Sure, but there's a middle ground, right? Like there's some, like I think you're going to see more and more. Let me ask you the question: don't you think we'll see more potential litigation around this of, you know, a Change Healthcare incident where there's this large impact to revenue? They're not going to go to zero, but there's going to be hey, you didn't take all the necessary steps. Yeah. We've already seen CISOs on the hook, right? Like this is going to the ball's going to keep rolling and gathering moss.
Yeah, and it's going to roll down to the CISO in almost every case, right? It's the best job, the security bullet sponge, right, for the business now.
The Secret Service of the security world.
Yeah. You got to say, the president, your life's good enough to go. I mean, it's a challenge, right?
So the follow on to that is, you know, and you brought it up already in the discussion. What about making the ransomware payments illegal, right? So we had an earlier podcast. We dived a little bit into this, but I really want to focus on this because, you know, from my perspective, the only way to effectively solve this problem is really going to be to take away the motivation for it. And the motivation is payment. So I think everybody realizes that there's potential downsides to that. If you're a hospital and there's somebody whose potential life and limb is going to happen,
essentially every breach there, right? Like life is in danger now.
And you know, there's been stats that say when Medicaid people are in the hospital, without ransomware, it's 3 out of 100 die on a monthly basis on average. With ransomware, it's 4, right? So that's a 33% increase, right? It's a much larger increase than people would think out of that stat. If you have a large financial impact, your business is going to go to zero, right? Like you've got to pay. But I think that there's things that we could do to gate around that. But do you think that that's the long-term solution, or do you think we'll never get there?
I don't like the idea of telling someone they're not allowed to pay.
Okay.
Right? If they have to do what's best for their business and their employees, they should do it. But I do like your idea of having the government come in and give people alternate support so they don't have to pay. If you're going to go out of business, right, because a couple $1,000,000 is going to end you, and I know this sounds like weird socialism, maybe the government should come in and kind of help out with that to keep the business from going under.
Yeah, I don't know how weird socialism it is, right? Like, so Change Healthcare is going to affect everybody's pocketbook, right?
Absolutely.
Like, it's going to hit everybody in the form of some repercussion in the industry. Costs are going to go up, taxes are going to get something's going to happen,
nobody,
right? So
nobody wants to eat the government coming in and eating that $1.6 billion check for them for somebody not installing a patch when they were supposed to.
yeah, and maybe that's where we implement some type of control mechanism and say, like, in order to get reimbursed if you have an incident, you've got to have this minimum bar, these things in place, right? And like, I think that would be a fair trade-off for people to say, okay, well, we're willing to support the economy and stop this and shut it off. Because even if you shut it off cold turkey, it would take some amount of time. There'd be a window where it continued to happen until the motivation ceased, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting one. I don't know if it's feasible. It makes sense, right? Like, it won't make the ransomware groups go away because ransomware groups are international. Like, all you can do is make them stop targeting our companies.
It would have. Yeah, other countries would have to take the same kind of steps around it, right?
Yeah, and it just seems expensive, right? Where I think nobody really wants to eat it. They'll talk about it and debate it, but there's no clean solution to any of it that's clean enough to have somebody actually execute on it.
Yeah, I read a recent article where they were actually talking about potential for some government officials were talking about that's the goal at some point is to make it illegal, but the U.S. economy currently couldn't withstand making it illegal because of the repercussions that would happen from, I just said, companies closing, things happening, right? Results.
Well, I mean, normally, according to the internet, CEOs are all super rich guys, right?
That's what I heard. That's what I heard, John.
The last thing you want is a bunch of super rich guys all pissed off because they can't pay their ransomware and keep their business going. They'll create problems.
So what do you think about the future of ransomware attacks? Like, where's this all headed? What's the implications?
Yeah, just generally worse across the board.
Worse.
More impacts, larger targets, bigger ransoms, right? I mean, you've even seen it where it started with encryption, and then it went to the double extortion where they take your data out, and now you have them narking on you to the SEC, right? It's just layers, like whatever they can do to figure out.
To make it harder and harder and
harder.
harder.
How to inflict pain to get you to pay to get out of the pain, they'll do.
So, as we think about the kind of the future, and, there's a lot of challenges that law enforcement has in prosecuting, and whether we get into issues from the defense side, what do you think about the impact from current geopolitical tensions and state-sponsored cyber attacks? Where's that headed? Does it have an impact on the ransomware landscape? Does that become worse? And so
I think it's really easy to take your nation state attack and say that it's ransomware now, right? And we've even seen scenarios where ransomware has been used in political hacktivism, right? Where you go and you can join a ransomware group, get their tool, ransomware someone with it, and say, we don't want a ransom. We're doing this because of climate change, right?
Yeah, and that really crosses over into true terrorism, right?
Yeah, and the same bar that's been lowered for ransomware is now lowered there, right? Where you look at Aramco, right? You look at the Sands Casino where these were these massive destructive attacks, Sony, right? And ransomware is that same attack. The difference is they pay and then you give them the key. If there's no payment, no key, it's the same as deleting it.
Yeah, I really wonder if things like, Colonial Pipeline for sure, but Change Healthcare certainly, I think even worse, has elevated the visibility of this for people to think, I want a specific political goal. Maybe this is a really easy way to get it versus what we've done in the past.
I mean, it's definitely an easy way to get attention, right? Where you can take massive companies essentially to their knees and make international headlines for months.
So Where does this actually cross into cyber warfare? Like, where's the line on this? Is there a red line, or do you think we're already crossed
No, I think it's all
like,
just in the middle of it. Like cyber warfare is like the genre, right? It's pushing out, right? But I think that the majority of ransomware was really started, as an offshoot of cyber warfare, right? Where these were nation state actors, nation state techniques, nation state tools. I mean, and I feel bad for saying this. It was a large bank got hacked years and years ago, and there was this debate. New York financial, I think it was J.P. Morgan, but I don't remember 100%. And they actually used Russian nation state tools in the attack, and so everyone's like, "This is a nation state breach," and it turned out it wasn't.
Yeah.
It was just someone taking that tool chain from their day job and using it for their night job, right? And yeah, I mean, I don't see anything that we can do from a policy perspective that's really going to stop that.
So do you think it gets kinetic at some point? Like, should law enforcement, U.S. agencies actually go hot against actors in non-favorable jurisdictions in some way, whether it's cyber or whether it's actual physical kinetic?
I don't think there's anyone in any government anywhere that wants cyber to go hot. I mean, the interesting thing was,
But don't you see it headed that way?
So Israel did it with Hamas, right? And then they did like a super cheeky Twitter post about it where like Hamas hacked them and they blew up the headquarters, and they did like a Twitter post of the thing, and they were like, Hamas.exe deleted.
Yeah.
Right? That freaked me out, right? Because the nice thing with cyber is cyber has always begat cyber, right? Like there's kinetic warfare and there's cyber. But now
but if people are dying, hasn't that already crossed the line?
You would assume when we have dozens of, American men, women, and children dying, at some point somebody's got to say, this isn't espionage anymore. Like this is a problem, and it has to stop. And we are going to hold you accountable, like you killed those people. And not like this is some financial crime that's an inconvenience. Like people are dying, and at some point we need to start treating it with that level of seriousness.
Yeah, I think people for a long time have thought of anything in IT is cyber. We talked about this in the last podcast as well.
I mean, what's $1.6 billion to change healthcare? They have the money; they'll pay.
It's just thought as it's not a real thing. It happens in an ephemeral ether world, and there's no reality to it. When actually there are real world outcomes to this for average everyday people.
It's just hard to cut through it, right? It's not super clear, and people don't want to talk about it, frankly, right? Like if you're a healthcare company and you got ransomware and somebody died, the last thing you want to do is acknowledge that, right? Like healthcare is all about managing liability, frankly.
Yeah.
Right.
So wrapping up, kind of final question here. I'm just wondering, what's your sage advice you can give in the wisdom that you've had in the cyber arena for what organizations can do to actually be more prepared on the cyber front? What should they do?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to you have to educate yourself, right? Like you can't navigate through this threat landscape right now being like the ransomware is bad and not knowing what ransomware groups are out there, who's playing a threat to you, and what they do. It does not take a lot of time to gather that information, but it's unique to every company, so you have to do it yourself.
Really good advice. Jon, I want to thank you for being on this episode of Security Gets Serious.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks.